Sarah Mitchell had been reduced to something she never thought possible, standing outside the Riverside General Store with 4 hungry children, her pride shattered like glass on stone, asking strangers for help that never came. The autumn wind cut through her threadbare coat as she watched well-dressed townspeople hurry past, avoiding eye contact with the woman who had once been their equal. But when the massive mountain man emerged from the shadows and spoke those life-changing words, everything Sarah thought she knew about survival, dignity, and unexpected salvation was about to be turned upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, as Sarah Mitchell counted the remaining coins in her worn leather purse for the 3rd time. 18 cents. That was all that stood between her family and complete destitution. The autumn of 1882 had been particularly harsh, and what little work she'd been able to find over the summer had dried up completely as the seasons changed. Sarah sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the single room they now called home, watching her 4 children sleep in the early dawn light. 10-year-old Emma, the eldest, had wrapped her thin arms protectively around 6-year-old twins, Daniel and David, while 4-year-old Lucy clutched a corn-husk doll that Sarah had fashioned from scraps. Even in sleep, their faces showed the hollow look of constant hunger that had become their new reality. 3 months ago, they had lived in a proper house on Maple Street with a vegetable garden and white picket fence. Sarah's husband, Thomas Mitchell, had been the town's most respected blacksmith, his strong hands capable of crafting anything from horseshoes to intricate ironwork for the church. Their life hadn't been luxurious, but it had been stable, predictable, and filled with the kind of quiet contentment that Sarah now realized she had taken for granted. Everything changed on a sweltering July afternoon when Thomas collapsed while working at his forge. The town's only doctor, elderly Dr. Patterson, had done what he could, but Thomas's heart had simply given out from years of hard physical labor and the strain of providing for a growing family. At 34, Sarah had become a widow with 4 children and no clear way to support them. The first weeks after Thomas's death had been manageable, cushioned by the kindness of neighbors who brought casseroles and offered condolences. The blacksmith shop continued operating briefly under the supervision of Thomas's apprentice, a young man named Jake Morrison, who had learned the trade well but lacked the business acumen to keep customers coming. Within a month, Jake had found work in Denver, leaving Sarah with a fully equipped workshop, but no one skilled enough to use it profitably. Sarah had tried everything she could think of to generate income. She took in washing and mending, her fingers growing raw from handling lye soap and rough fabrics. She baked pies and bread to sell at the weekend market, though the cost of ingredients often left little profit after expenses. She even attempted to operate the blacksmith shop herself. But despite her familiarity with Thomas's work, she lacked the physical strength required for heavy metalwork and the technical knowledge needed for complex repairs. The house on Maple Street became too expensive to maintain without Thomas's steady income. The mortgage payments alone consumed more money than Sarah could earn through all her various efforts combined. After missing 2 consecutive payments, the bank had given her an ultimatum: pay the full amount owed within 30 days or face foreclosure. That deadline had passed 2 weeks ago. The family's descent into poverty had been swift and devastating. First came the sale of their furniture, piece by piece, to cover basic expenses. Sarah had watched strangers carry away the dining table where Thomas had carved their children's names, the rocking chair where she'd nursed each baby, the bedroom set that had been her wedding gift from Thomas's parents. Each sale provided temporary relief, but pushed them deeper into a lifestyle that felt increasingly foreign and desperate. After losing the house, they had moved into a single room above Murphy's Tavern, the cheapest accommodation Sarah could find in Cedar Falls. The room was barely large enough for one person, let alone a family of 5. The thin walls allowed every sound from the tavern below to filter up through the floorboards. Drunken laughter, heated arguments, and the occasional crash of breaking glass that would wake the children in the middle of the night. The smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke permeated everything they owned. Sarah's attempts to find steady employment had been consistently unsuccessful. The town's businesses were small family operations that had no need for additional workers, especially a woman with 4 young children who would require flexible scheduling. The few positions that had been available, cleaning houses for wealthy families, working in the hotel kitchen, serving tables at the diner, paid wages so low that Sarah would have earned less than the cost of having someone watch her children while she worked. The social isolation had been almost as difficult as the financial hardship. People who had once greeted Sarah warmly on the street now seemed to look through her as if she'd become invisible. Former friends found excuses to avoid conversation, uncomfortable with the reminder that economic disaster could strike anyone. Even at church, where Sarah had hoped to find community support, she felt the weight of pitying stares and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Emma, her eldest daughter, had begun showing signs of stress that broke Sarah's heart. The bright, cheerful child who had once chatted constantly about her friends and school activities had become quiet and withdrawn. She helped with her younger siblings without being asked, accepting responsibilities that no 10-year-old should have to bear. Sarah often caught Emma staring out their single window with an expression of worry that belonged on an adult face. The twins, Daniel and David, had developed the habit of hoarding any food they could find, hiding scraps in their pockets or under their shared pillow. Their behavior spoke to a fear of hunger that children their age shouldn't have to understand. They'd stopped asking for toys or treats, seeming to instinctively know that such requests would only add to their mother's distress. Little Lucy, at 4 years old, was perhaps the most heartbreaking to watch. She had begun asking when Daddy was coming home, despite having attended his funeral 3 months earlier. Sarah realized that Lucy's mind was protecting her from a reality too painful to fully comprehend, creating a fantasy where their current situation was temporary and Thomas would soon return to restore their normal life. Sarah's own physical condition had deteriorated significantly over the past month. She had developed the habit of giving most of her food to the children, claiming she wasn't hungry or had already eaten. The result was a dramatic weight loss that made her clothes hang loosely on her frame and created dark circles under her eyes that no amount of rest could eliminate. Her hands, once soft from the comfortable life of a blacksmith's wife, had become rough and calloused from scrubbing other people's laundry and taking on any manual work she could find. Sleep had become elusive, partly due to hunger, but mostly due to the constant anxiety about their future. Sarah would lie awake, calculating and recalculating their meager resources, trying to figure out how to stretch 18 cents into enough food to last until she could find some form of income. The mathematics never worked out favorably, leading to planning sessions that stretched late into the night and left her exhausted, but no closer to a solution. The approaching winter added urgency to their situation. Colorado winters were harsh, even for families with adequate resources. For a family living in a single unheated room with insufficient clothing and inconsistent food, winter could be fatal. Sarah had seen other families succumb to the combination of cold, hunger, and disease that claimed lives among the poorest residents each year. The thought of losing one of her children to conditions she couldn't prevent kept her awake, even when exhaustion should have provided relief. The town's charity resources were limited and already stretched thin. The church operated a small food pantry, but it was intended for temporary assistance rather than ongoing support. Pastor Williams had been kind but clear about the limitations of what the congregation could provide. The town had no formal welfare system, and families in crisis were expected to rely on relatives or find their own solutions to economic hardship. Sarah had no relatives to turn to. Thomas's parents had died before their marriage, and his only brother lived somewhere in California with no forwarding address. Sarah's own family consisted of a sister in Boston who had married well but maintained no contact since Sarah's wedding to a common tradesman. The few letters Sarah had sent requesting assistance had gone unanswered, suggesting that her sister's silence was deliberate rather than accidental. As Sarah sat in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to her children's breathing and calculating how to make 18 cents provide at least one meal for 5 people, she realized they had reached the point where traditional solutions were no longer adequate. The jobs weren't available, the charity was insufficient, and the relatives were non-existent. Something dramatic would have to change, or her family would not survive the coming winter. The sound of Emma stirring in the bed reminded Sarah that her children would soon wake, expecting breakfast. She had nothing to offer them, except perhaps a pot of thin oatmeal made with more water than oats, if she was careful with portions. The realization that she could no longer protect her children from hunger through any conventional means settled over her like a weight that made breathing difficult. Outside their window, Cedar Falls was beginning to wake up. She could hear the clip-clop of horses' hooves on the main street and the distant sound of shopkeepers opening their stores for another day of business. Somewhere in that normal world of commerce and routine, there had to be an answer to their desperate situation. Sarah just couldn't see it yet. Rising from the bed, she moved quietly to the window and looked down at the street below. People moved with purpose, heading to jobs and responsibilities that provided them with security Sarah could barely remember. The contrast between their obvious stability and her family's precarious situation was stark enough to bring tears to her eyes. Today would have to be different. Today, she would have to find the courage to do something she had never imagined herself capable of doing. Today, she would have to swallow what remained of her pride and ask for help from strangers, because the alternative was watching her children waste away from hunger while she maintained the dignity that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of their desperate circumstances. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah Mitchell woke her children gently as the morning light filtered through their single, grimy window. Emma stirred first, her mature eyes immediately scanning her mother's face for signs of hope or despair. The twins rubbed their eyes sleepily, while little Lucy clung to her corn-husk doll, whispering something about breakfast that made Sarah's heart clench. "Children," Sarah said softly, gathering them around her on the narrow bed, "today we're going to try something different. We're going to go into town and ask people if they need any help with their work." Emma's brow furrowed with concern beyond her years. "Mama, you already asked everyone. Mrs. Henderson at the hotel said she didn't need help, and Mr. Clark at the general store said—" "I know what they said, sweetheart," Sarah interrupted gently. "But today we're going to be more direct. We're going to show people that we're a family who's willing to work hard for fair wages." Sarah had spent the sleepless hours before dawn formulating what she hoped would be their salvation. Her plan was systematic and she believed dignified. Rather than approaching individual business owners as she had before, she would position her family strategically at the town's busiest intersection during the morning rush. People would see them as a unit, a capable mother and 4 well-behaved children who represented not burden, but opportunity. The strategy was carefully calculated. Sarah had observed the daily patterns of Cedar Falls residents over the past weeks, noting which merchants arrived early, which families did their shopping before the afternoon heat, and which prosperous citizens made regular appearances on Main Street. She had identified at least a dozen potential employers who might need seasonal help as winter approached. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, wife of the bank president, employed 2 servants, but frequently complained about the difficulty of finding reliable help. Surely she would appreciate a hard-working widow who could clean, cook, and manage household tasks with the efficiency of someone who had once run her own comfortable home. Sarah had even practiced a brief speech explaining her qualifications and availability. The Riverside Hotel, owned by the prosperous Henderson family, was expanding to accommodate the increasing number of travelers passing through Cedar Falls. Sarah had noticed construction materials being delivered and workers coming and going at unusual hours. They would need additional staff for cleaning rooms, serving meals, and managing the increased laundry. A family willing to work together could handle multiple tasks more efficiently than individual employees. Miller Johnson, who operated the largest grain storage facility in town, hired seasonal workers during harvest time. Though the main harvest was complete, there would be ongoing work sorting, cleaning, and preparing grain for transport. Sarah's children were old enough to help with light tasks, and the work could provide income through the winter months, when other employment was scarce. Even the church might need assistance. Pastor Williams had mentioned during Sunday services that the congregation was growing and the building required maintenance that the volunteer committee couldn't handle alone. Sarah could organize cleaning schedules, coordinate volunteer activities, and manage the practical aspects of church operations that currently fell to overburdened members. Sarah's plan extended beyond immediate employment to longer-term stability. Once she demonstrated her capabilities and reliability, she could build a network of satisfied customers who would provide steady work. Other families had survived difficult times by creating multiple income streams, taking in laundry, providing childcare, selling baked goods, and offering domestic services to busy households. The key was presentation. Sarah had carefully selected their clothing for maximum impact. Her own dress was her finest remaining garment, a dark blue wool that had been her Sunday best before their circumstances changed. She had mended a small tear in the sleeve and polished the buttons until they gleamed. The children wore their cleanest clothes, with faces scrubbed and hair neatly combed. They would appear as a respectable family, experiencing temporary difficulties, not as charity cases. She had rehearsed responses to likely questions and objections. When people expressed concern about her ability to handle both work responsibilities and childcare, she would explain that Emma was mature enough to supervise her siblings during working hours. When employers worried about the reliability of someone in desperate circumstances, she would reference her years as a successful blacksmith's wife who had managed both household and business responsibilities. Most importantly, Sarah had prepared herself mentally for the challenge of asking for help. This represented a fundamental shift in her identity from someone who provided assistance to others, bringing meals to sick neighbors, contributing to church fundraisers, offering advice to younger wives, to someone who needed support from her community. The psychological adjustment was as difficult as the practical preparations. She had practiced her opening words dozens of times. "Good morning. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and these are my children. We're looking for work opportunities that would allow us to contribute to your business while supporting our family. Direct, professional, and emphasizing contribution rather than need." She would let her qualifications and willingness to work speak louder than any plea for charity. The timing was crucial. Sarah planned to position the family at the intersection of Main Street and Church Avenue at exactly 8 o'clock, when the morning rush would bring the maximum number of potential employers within view. They would remain visible and available until noon, demonstrating both persistence and respect for business hours. Sarah had even prepared contingency plans. If direct approaches to business owners proved unsuccessful, they would offer services to individual families, yard work, house cleaning, childcare, or any other tasks that busy households might need assistance completing. The twins, despite their young age, were capable of simple tasks like gathering kindling, sweeping porches, or carrying packages. Emma could mind younger children while parents ran errands. The plan included a presentation strategy that would highlight their family's unique advantages. Unlike single workers, they could handle multiple tasks simultaneously. While Sarah worked inside a business, Emma could manage her siblings in nearby areas, ready to assist with simple tasks or run errands. This flexibility would make them more valuable than individual employees who required separate supervision. Sarah had calculated that they needed to earn at least $2 per week to cover their basic expenses, room rent, minimal food, and essential clothing repairs. This seemed achievable if they could secure a combination of regular part-time work and occasional odd jobs. Several families earning this amount individually could easily provide enough work to support her family if properly coordinated. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her plan. Sarah had been raised to believe that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that proper families managed their own affairs without burdening others. The idea of publicly revealing their desperate circumstances went against every lesson her mother had taught about maintaining dignity and self-reliance. But dignity, Sarah had come to realize, was a luxury they could no longer afford. Real dignity meant doing whatever was necessary to ensure her children's survival, even if it required abandoning the social conventions that had once seemed so important. Her children's welfare outweighed her personal pride or the opinions of people who had already demonstrated their unwillingness to assist her family. Voluntarily, she had anticipated the likely reactions they would encounter. Some people would offer sympathy but no practical help, expressing regret that they couldn't assist while making no real effort to find ways to provide work. Others would suggest resources she'd already exhausted or offer advice that demonstrated their lack of understanding about her actual circumstances. The most challenging responses would come from people who questioned her life choices or implied that her situation resulted from personal failings. Sarah had prepared herself to maintain composure when faced with suggestions that she should have planned better financially, should have developed marketable skills before her husband's death, or should be grateful for whatever minimal assistance the community had already provided. But Sarah also anticipated positive responses. Cedar Falls was fundamentally a decent community where people understood the value of hard work and the unpredictability of circumstances beyond individual control. Many residents had experienced their own economic challenges and would remember the uncertainty of starting over in a new place with limited resources. The plan required her children's cooperation, and Sarah had carefully explained their role in the day's activities. Emma would help manage her siblings while demonstrating her own maturity and capability. The twins would remain quiet and well-behaved, showing potential employers that the Mitchell children were disciplined and wouldn't create disruptions. Lucy would simply be herself, a sweet 4-year-old, whose presence would remind people that this was a family deserving of community support. Sarah had prepared simple tasks that each child could demonstrate if asked. Emma could show her reading skills and ability to write clearly. The twins could display their knowledge of numbers and their willingness to follow directions. Even Lucy could demonstrate her good manners and cheerful disposition that would make her welcome in family-oriented businesses. As Sarah helped her children dress that morning, she felt a mixture of hope and terror that made her hands shake slightly. This plan represented their best remaining option for avoiding complete destitution. If it failed, they would be forced to consider alternatives that Sarah couldn't bear to think about: separation of the family, reliance on institutional charity, or leaving Cedar Falls entirely with no destination and no resources for travel. But failure wasn't an option Sarah would accept. Somewhere in Cedar Falls was a person or family who needed exactly what the Mitchell family could provide. Her job was to find that opportunity and present her family as the solution to someone else's problem. This wasn't charity, this was business, and Sarah intended to approach it with all the professionalism and determination she could summon. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the sounds from Main Street indicated that the business day was beginning. Sarah gathered her children, checked their appearance one final time, and prepared to implement the most important plan of her life. Everything they had endured over the past 3 months had led to this moment. Today would determine whether the Mitchell family would survive the approaching winter or face circumstances too terrible to imagine. "Come along, children," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "Today, we're going to find our new beginning." The morning air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter as Sarah Mitchell led her 4 children down the wooden steps from their room above Murphy's Tavern. Main Street was beginning to show signs of life. Shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, delivery wagons rumbling over the dirt road, and early customers heading to their daily business. Sarah positioned her family at the corner of Main Street and Church Avenue, exactly as she had planned. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to her carefully rehearsed strategy. Sarah approached Mrs. Victoria Ashworth as the banker's wife emerged from the millinery shop, arms laden with packages. The conversation was polite but brief. Mrs. Ashworth explained that she had recently hired a new girl and wouldn't need additional help until spring. She offered Sarah a sympathetic smile and a suggestion to try the hotel, the Henderson. Family at the Riverside Hotel was equally courteous but unhelpful. Mrs. Henderson listened patiently to Sarah's presentation, complimented her on her well-behaved children, but explained that their expansion plans had been postponed due to unexpected construction costs. Perhaps in a few months, when business picked up again, Miller Johnson wasn't at his grain facility. His foreman explained that the seasonal work had ended the previous week, and no additional help would be needed until spring planting. The church secretary suggested that Sarah speak with Pastor Williams after Sunday service, but couldn't commit to any immediate opportunities. By 10 o'clock, Sarah had systematically visited every business on her carefully prepared list. Some proprietors were kind, but had no work available. Others seemed uncomfortable with her direct approach and hurried through conversations with obvious relief when they could politely decline. A few offered vague promises to keep her in mind if anything became available, but Sarah recognized these as polite dismissals rather than genuine possibilities. The children had remained remarkably well-behaved throughout the morning, but Sarah could see signs of hunger and fatigue beginning to show. Lucy had grown quiet and was clinging more tightly to her doll. The twins were asking whispered questions about when they might eat something. Emma was trying to maintain her helpful demeanor while shooting worried glances at her mother's increasingly strained expression. It was nearly 11 o'clock when Sarah made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Though she couldn't know it at the time, standing at the corner where they had begun their morning, watching well-dressed citizens hurry past without making eye contact, Sarah realized that her carefully planned strategy had failed completely. No one needed their services. No one was willing to take a chance on a desperate family. No one wanted to become involved in circumstances that might prove complicated or demanding. The 18 cents in her purse represented perhaps 2 days of minimal food if she was extremely careful with portions. After that, there would be nothing. No money, no prospects, no family to turn to, and winter approaching with its promise of cold that could kill unprepared families. The mathematics of their situation were brutal and inescapable. Sarah looked down at her children's upturned faces, all watching her with the kind of trust that children reserve for parents they believe can solve any problem. Emma's mature eyes held questions she was too young to be asking. The twins were leaning against each other for warmth and comfort. Lucy had begun that peculiar stillness that very young children exhibit when they sense that something is fundamentally wrong in their world, but lack the vocabulary to express their fears. "Mama," Emma asked softly, "should we go home now?" Home, their single room above a tavern with no food and no hope of acquiring any through conventional means. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of her failure settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She had planned so carefully, prepared so thoroughly, and presented her family so professionally. None of it had mattered. The realization came to her with devastating clarity. She was going to have to beg, not the dignified request for employment opportunities that she had practiced, not the professional presentation of a family willing to work for fair wages. Actual begging, standing on a street corner with her children and asking strangers for money to buy food. The thing she had sworn she would never do, the line she had told herself she would never cross, was now the only option standing between her family and starvation. Sarah's hands were shaking as she walked her children to a position near the general store, where the morning foot traffic was heaviest. Several people she recognized were conducting business, neighbors who had once treated her as an equal when she lived in the house on Maple Street. Now she would have to stand before them with her palm extended, asking for charity from people who might remember her previous prosperity. "Children," she said quietly, gathering them close to her, "we're going to try something different now. We're going to ask people if they can spare a little money to help us buy food." Emma's eyes widened with understanding and something that looked like shame. At 10 years old, she was mature enough to grasp the social implications of what her mother was proposing. The twins looked confused but obedient, while Lucy simply nodded and hugged her doll tighter. The first person to approach was Mrs. Clara Bennett, wife of the town's only lawyer. Sarah had known Clara casually through church activities, and they had always exchanged pleasantries when their paths crossed. Now, as Clara emerged from the general store with her weekly shopping, Sarah found herself in the impossible position of asking for help from someone who had once been her social peer. "Mrs. Bennett," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wondered if you might be able to spare a small amount to help us buy food for the children." Clara's reaction was everything Sarah had feared it would be. The woman's face cycled rapidly through surprise, discomfort, and something that looked like panic. She clutched her packages closer to her chest, as if Sarah might snatch them away, took a step backward, and stammered something about not carrying cash for security reasons. Within moments she had hurried away, leaving Sarah standing with her outstretched hand and 4 children who had witnessed their mother's public humiliation. The pattern repeated itself with slight variations over the next hour. Some people ignored them completely, stepping around the family as if they were obstacles rather than human beings. Others offered brief expressions of sympathy, but no actual assistance, explaining that they had no money with them, or suggesting resources that Sarah had already exhausted. A few seemed genuinely disturbed by the sight of the Mitchell family in such desperate circumstances, but their discomfort translated into avoidance rather than help. The most painful encounters came from people who had once been friends or acquaintances. These individuals recognized Sarah and her children, understood exactly how far their circumstances had deteriorated, and seemed to view their desperation as somehow contagious. Former neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past them. Women who had once chatted with Sarah after church services now found urgent reasons to hurry in different directions. By noon, Sarah had collected exactly 27 cents from strangers who had never known her during better times. Added to her original 18 cents, she now possessed 45 cents, enough for perhaps 3 days of minimal food if she was extremely careful with portions. It represented progress, but barely enough to justify the complete destruction of her dignity and her children's innocence about their family's place in the community. The children had grown increasingly quiet as the morning progressed. Emma was old enough to understand that they were now officially charity cases, dependent on the kindness of strangers for basic survival. The twins had stopped asking questions about when they would eat, seeming to grasp that food was no longer something they could expect with regularity. Lucy had retreated into herself, speaking only to her doll and avoiding eye contact with the adults who occasionally dropped coins into her mother's hand. It was just past noon when everything changed in a way that Sarah could never have anticipated. She was standing with her children near the hitching post outside Riverside General Store, trying to summon the courage to approach another group of potential donors when she became aware of someone watching them. The sensation was subtle at first, the feeling of being observed that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. When she turned to identify the source of her discomfort, she saw a figure that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The man was enormous, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His clothing marked him as someone who lived outside civilized society. Buckskin jacket, worn soft with age, heavy boots suitable for mountain terrain, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed features tanned dark by constant exposure to sun and wind. A full beard covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was longer than any respectable townsman would wear. But it was his eyes that captured Sarah's attention and held it. Dark brown, almost black, they were studying her family with an intensity that was both unsettling and somehow protective. He had been watching them for some time, she realized, long enough to understand exactly what they were doing and why. The man stepped away from the shadows where he had been standing and began walking toward them with a measured pace that suggested he was accustomed to making decisions deliberately. Several townspeople noticed his approach and moved aside, their expressions mixing curiosity with wariness. This was clearly someone who rarely visited Cedar Falls, someone whose presence disrupted the normal rhythms of civilized society. Sarah instinctively gathered her children closer to her, uncertain whether this imposing figure represented opportunity or threat. Emma pressed against her mother's side while the twins moved to stand protectively near Lucy, who was too young to understand the potential implications of their situation but old enough to sense that something significant was about to happen. The mountain man stopped directly in front of their small family group, towering over them like a force of nature. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rough from disuse, carrying the kind of authority that comes from surviving in environments where mistakes can be fatal. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed oddly formal, coming from someone so obviously removed from conventional society. "I've been watching you and your children for the better part of an hour. I can see you're in a difficult situation." Sarah found herself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the stranger's directness and uncertain about his intentions. The mountain man continued speaking, his eyes moving from her face to encompass each of her children with a look that seemed to be making some kind of assessment. "These young ones look like they could use a proper meal and a warm place to sleep. From what I've observed, the people in this town aren't inclined to provide much in the way of assistance." Sarah managed to find her voice, though it came out smaller and less steady than she intended. "We're managing, sir. Thank you for your concern." The mountain man's expression shifted slightly, and Sarah thought she detected something that might have been amusement beneath his serious demeanor. "Ma'am, I've been managing in the wilderness for more years than I care to count. I recognize the difference between managing and barely surviving. You and your children are closer to the latter than the former." Before Sarah could respond, the man made a statement that would change everything about their desperate circumstances, though she couldn't possibly understand the full implications in that moment. "I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that couldn't be taken back. "You and these children can come with me. I've got a place up in the mountains where there's food, warmth, and safety. In exchange, I'll expect you to help maintain the household and assist with the work that needs doing." Sarah stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. This stranger, this intimidating mountain man, whose very presence seemed to unsettle the entire town, was offering to take responsibility for her family's welfare. The proposal was so unexpected, so completely outside anything she had considered possible, that she found herself unable to form a coherent response. The mountain man seemed to understand her confusion and continued speaking in the same measured tone. "I know this is sudden, and I know you don't know anything about me, but I can tell you this. Your children won't go hungry, they won't be cold, and they won't have to watch their mother beg for coins from people who should be ashamed of themselves." He paused, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's directly. When he spoke again, his words would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. "They're all mine now, if you'll have it that way. All of you, under my protection, with my resources, as part of my household. The choice is yours, ma'am, but I'd recommend making it quickly. Winter's coming, and from what I can see, you don't have many options left." Sarah Mitchell stared at the towering mountain man, her mind reeling from the impossibility of his proposition. Around them, the normal rhythm of Cedar Falls continued, shopkeepers conducting business, children playing in the street, horses clip-clopping over the wooden boards. But Sarah felt as though she and her family had been transported into a completely different reality where the rules of civilized society no longer applied. The stranger waited patiently for her response, his dark eyes never leaving her face. There was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he seemed comfortable with silence, while she struggled to process what he was offering. Behind her, she could hear Emma's sharp intake of breath and feel the twins pressing closer to her skirts. Even little Lucy had grown quiet, sensing that this moment would determine something important about their future. "Sir," Sarah managed to say, her voice hoarse from the morning's humiliation, "I don't even know your name. You're asking me to take my children into the wilderness with a complete stranger." "Name's Ezekiel Harrington," the mountain man replied. "Most folks who know me call me Zeke. I've been living in these mountains for 12 years, ever since I came back from the war. Got a cabin about 8 miles north of here, up in the high country, where the hunting's good and the winters are hard but manageable for those who know what they're doing." He paused, studying her children with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. "I know this seems like madness to a town woman, taking your young ones to live with a man you've never met, in country that can kill you if you make the wrong choices. But I've been watching your situation this morning, and I can tell you with certainty that staying here will kill them just as surely, only slower and with more suffering." Sarah felt a flush of shame and anger. "We're not dying, Mr. Harrington. We're experiencing temporary difficulties." "Ma'am," Zeke interrupted gently, "I've seen enough hunger to recognize it. Your boy there," he nodded toward Daniel, "has been eyeing that apple in the store window like it's made of gold. Your little girl hasn't spoken above a whisper since I started watching, which tells me she's too weak to waste energy on unnecessary words. And you," he studied Sarah's face with uncomfortable accuracy, "you haven't eaten a full meal in days, maybe weeks." The truth of his observations hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had thought she was hiding their desperation effectively, maintaining the appearance of a family experiencing minor setbacks. But this stranger had seen through her pretense within minutes, recognizing signs that the townspeople had either missed or chosen to ignore. Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, what does he mean about the mountains?" Zeke crouched down to Emma's level, bringing his imposing frame closer to the children's height. When he spoke to her, his voice gentled considerably. "I mean that I live in a place where there's deer for meat, streams full of trout, gardens that produce vegetables through the summer, and enough firewood to keep a cabin warm all winter long. It's not fancy like town living, but nobody goes hungry, and nobody has to ask strangers for money to buy food." David, the bolder of the twins, stepped forward slightly. "Are you a bad man?" "Mama says we shouldn't talk to bad men." Zeke's weather-beaten face creased into what might have been a smile beneath his full beard. "Your mama's right about that. There are bad men in this world, and children should be careful. But I'm not one of them. I'm just a man who's lived alone too long and thinks maybe it's time to have some company that isn't just deer and raccoons." Sarah's mind was racing through the practical implications of his offer. He was proposing to take responsibility for feeding and sheltering 5 people, including 4 children who would require care, education, and protection. The generosity seemed too extraordinary to be real, which made her suspicious about his true motivations. "Mr. Harrington," she said carefully, What exactly would you expect in return for this arrangement? Zeke stood up slowly, his expression becoming more serious. I'd expect you to help maintain the household. Cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, preserving food for winter. The kind of work a mountain cabin requires to stay livable. Your oldest girl looks capable of learning to help with lighter tasks, and the boys are old enough to gather firewood and assist with simple chores. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I'd also expect honesty between us about what this arrangement is and isn't. I'm not looking for a wife, if that's what you're wondering. I'm offering shelter and sustenance to a family that needs both, in exchange for help managing a homestead that's too much for one person to handle properly. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and continued uncertainty. His clarification about marriage removed one major concern, but it raised others. And if we came with you, how long would we stay? What happens when spring arrives and circumstances might change? That would be up to you, Zeke replied. I'm not looking to hold anyone against their will, but I'll tell you straight, mountain living changes people. Most folks who adapt to it find that town life loses its appeal. The wilderness has a way of showing you what's truly necessary, and what's just civilization's way of complicating simple things. Lucy had been listening to the conversation with the serious attention that small children sometimes display when they sense that important decisions are being made by the adults around them. Suddenly, she stepped away from her mother's side and walked directly up to Zeke, tilting her head back to look up at his towering figure. "Do you have food at your house?" she asked in her clear, childish voice. Zeke crouched down again, bringing himself to her eye level. "Yes, little one. I have venison jerky, smoked fish, preserved vegetables, and enough supplies to last through winter. There's also fresh milk from a goat who's very friendly, and honey from wild bees that I harvest every fall." Lucy considered this information with the gravity of someone much older. "Mama, I think we should go with the nice man. I'm very hungry." The innocent honesty of her youngest daughter's statement broke through all of Sarah's careful reasoning and desperate calculations. Lucy was hungry. They were all hungry, and growing hungrier every day. Despite Sarah's efforts to hide their desperation behind plans and schemes, and the pretense that temporary difficulties could be overcome through determination and hard work, Sarah looked at her other children, seeing in their faces the same quiet desperation that Lucy had voiced so simply. Emma's mature eyes held a question that went beyond immediate hunger to longer-term survival. The twins were leaning against each other in the way they did when they were tired, scared or overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their understanding. The choice, Sarah realized, wasn't really between safety and danger, or between the known and unknown. The choice was between slow starvation in a town that had already demonstrated its unwillingness to help them, and taking a chance with a stranger who was offering what no one else would provide, enough food to keep her children alive. "If we came with you," Sarah said slowly, "we would leave today." "Right now," Zeke confirmed. "I've got supplies to gather and a wagon outside of town where I left my mule team. We could be at the cabin before nightfall, and your children could have their first full meal in longer than they should have to remember." The mention of a full meal decided the matter. Sarah took a deep breath and made the choice that would alter everything about their lives. "Mr. Harrington, we accept your offer." Zeke nodded as if he had expected this outcome all along. "Good. We'll need to collect whatever belongings you have, and then we'll head out. The mountain roads aren't kind to travelers after dark, and there's weather coming. That will make the journey more difficult if we—" Wait, the next hour passed in a blur of activity that felt dreamlike to Sarah. They returned to their room above Murphy's Tavern to gather their few possessions, clothing, a few precious books, Thomas's tools that Sarah had been unable to sell, and the children's small treasures that had survived their descent into poverty. Everything they owned fit into 2 carpet bags and a wooden box that had once held Thomas's blacksmithing supplies. Zeke waited outside the tavern, his presence drawing curious stares from passers-by who had never seen anyone quite like him in Cedar Falls. When Sarah emerged with her packed belongings, he took the heavier items, without comment, and began leading them toward the edge of town where he had left his transportation. The wagon was unlike anything Sarah had seen before, built for mountain terrain rather than town streets, with high sides and reinforced wheels designed to handle rocky trails. Two sturdy mules stood in their traces, animals that looked capable of pulling heavy loads over difficult ground. A large canvas tarp covered supplies that suggested Zeke had been planning for an extended journey. "Climb up," he instructed, helping each child into the wagon bed, where thick blankets had been arranged to provide comfortable seating. Sarah settled herself among her children, still hardly believing that they were actually leaving Cedar Falls with this mysterious stranger. As Zeke guided the mules away from the town and onto a narrow trail that led into the foothills, Sarah watched the familiar buildings of Cedar Falls grow smaller behind them. The general store where she had been humiliated, the church where she had prayed for assistance that never came, the street corner where she had swallowed her pride and begged for coins. All of it was disappearing into the distance as they entered terrain she had never seen before. The mountain trail was more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. The wagon tilted and swayed as the mules navigated rocks and steep grades that would have been impossible for town-bred horses to manage. The children gripped the sides of the wagon and each other, their eyes wide as they watched the civilized world fall away behind them and the wilderness rise up around them. Pine trees grew thicker and taller as they climbed higher, creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns across the trail. The air grew cooler and thinner, carrying scents that Sarah had never experienced. Pine resin, wild herbs, and the clean smell of snow-fed streams. Birds called from the forest, with voices different from the sparrows and robins of town life. Zeke drove with the easy confidence of someone who had traveled this route countless times. He pointed out landmarks and natural features to the children, explaining which plants were edible, where animals came to drink, and how to read the signs that indicated weather changes. His knowledge of the wilderness was encyclopedic, and Sarah began to understand that they were entering his domain, a world where he possessed the skills and experience necessary for survival. "How much farther?" Emma asked, as the afternoon light began to slant through the trees at a sharper angle. "Another hour, maybe less," Zeke replied. "We'll crest this ridge and then drop down into the valley where the cabin sits. You'll be able to see it from the high point." True to his word, within the hour they reached a rocky outcrop that provided a view into a hidden valley surrounded by towering peaks. Sarah gasped when she saw their destination, a substantial log cabin sitting in a cleared meadow beside a stream that sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see outbuildings that suggested a well-established homestead rather than the primitive shelter she had been imagining. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed, and Sarah had to agree. The cabin was larger than their former house in Cedar Falls, built from massive logs that spoke of permanence and careful craftsmanship. A covered porch ran along the front, and glass windows reflected the surrounding mountains like mirrors. Gardens, though now dormant for winter, showed signs of extensive cultivation. A barn, smokehouse, and other structures indicated a level of comfort and self-sufficiency that exceeded what most town dwellers enjoyed. "Welcome home," Zeke said, simply as he guided the wagon down the final slope toward their new life. As they approached the cabin, Sarah felt a mixture of relief, apprehension, and something that might have been hope stirring in her chest for the first time in months. Her children were about to have that full meal Zeke had promised. They would sleep warm and safe, without the sound of drunken arguments filtering up through tavern floorboards. Tomorrow they would wake up in a place where their survival didn't depend on the charity of strangers or the success of increasingly desperate schemes. But they would also wake up in the wilderness, dependent on a man they barely knew, in circumstances that would require them to learn entirely new ways of living. The mountain man had kept his word about bringing them to safety, but Sarah understood that their real journey was just beginning. The first thing that struck Sarah as they entered Zeke's cabin was the overwhelming warmth. Not just the physical heat radiating from a massive stone fireplace, but the warmth of a space that had been carefully maintained and thoughtfully organized. The interior was far more spacious and comfortable than she had dared imagine, with hand-hewn furniture that spoke of both skill and patience in its creation. Thick woolen rugs covered the plank floors, and shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and supplies arranged with military precision. A large wooden table dominated the center of the main room, already set with pewter plates and cups that gleamed in the firelight. The smell of something savory simmering in a large pot over the fire made Sarah's mouth water, and her children pressed closer together in unconscious hunger. "Sit yourselves down," Zeke said, gesturing toward the chairs around the table. "I put a stew on the fire before I left for town this morning, figuring I might be bringing company back with me." Emma looked up at him with curiosity. "You knew you were going to ask us to come home with you?" Zeke ladled the stew into bowls, his movements efficient and practiced. "I've been watching your family's situation develop over the past few weeks. When I saw your mother preparing to take you all into town this morning, dressed in your finest clothes and carrying yourselves with the kind of dignity that comes before a fall, I suspected the day would end with decisions that couldn't be delayed any longer." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment mixed with something approaching anger. "You were spying on us?" "I was observing," Zeke corrected gently, setting a bowl in front of each child. "There's a difference. I come to town for supplies every few weeks, and I pay attention to changes that might affect my business dealings. Your husband's death was significant news in a small community, and your family's declining circumstances were obvious to anyone who cared to look." He placed a bowl in front of Sarah, and the rich aroma of meat and vegetables made her realize exactly how long it had been since she had eaten anything substantial. The children were already eating with the focused intensity of people who had nearly forgotten what it felt like to have enough food. "Why didn't you approach us sooner?" Sarah asked, though she was finding it difficult to maintain her indignation, while watching her children enjoy their first full meal in weeks. Zeke settled himself at the head of the table with his own bowl, because approaching too early would have been insulting to your pride and probably counterproductive to your welfare. You needed to exhaust the conventional options before you could seriously consider unconventional solutions. A woman with your background and education had to discover for herself that dignity and desperation don't coexist comfortably. Sarah stared at him, unsettled by his accurate reading of her psychological journey over the past months. "You seem to know a great deal about situations you've never experienced yourself, haven't I?" Zeke's dark eyes met hers across the table. "I came back from the war with nothing but the clothes on my back and skills that weren't particularly useful for civilian life. I spent 2 years trying to fit back into society, working jobs that felt meaningless, living in boarding houses that smelled like other people's failures, pretending that the things I'd seen and done could be forgotten if I just acted normal enough." He paused, taking a spoonful of his stew before continuing. "Pride kept me trying to succeed according to other people's definitions of success. It took complete failure and a winter spent nearly starving in a mining camp before I realized that starting over meant abandoning everything I thought I knew about how life was supposed to work." Emma had been listening while she ate, her mature mind processing the implications of Zeke's story. "Is that when you came to the mountains?" "That's when I stopped trying to be someone I wasn't," Zeke replied. "The mountains just happened to be where I could build the kind of life that made sense to me. Turns out that what I learned during the war how to survive in harsh conditions, how to plan for contingencies, how to make life or death decisions without hesitation. Those skills are actually quite valuable if you're willing to live somewhere that requires them. David, who had been quietly working his way through his second bowl of stew, looked up with the directness that 6-year-old boys sometimes display. "Were you a soldier?" "I was," Zeke confirmed. "Spent 3 years fighting in places that taught me more about human nature than I ever wanted to know. Learned that civilization is thinner than most people realize, and that survival often depends on understanding which rules matter and which ones are just conveniences that disappear when circumstances become difficult." Sarah found herself studying Zeke more carefully as he spoke with her children. His interaction with them was patient and respectful, treating even little Lucy's questions as worthy of serious consideration. She had expected a mountain hermit to be awkward or uncomfortable around children, but Zeke seemed naturally suited to their direct way of viewing the world. "What kinds of work will we be doing here?" Emma asked, practical concerns already occupying her thoughts. Zeke's expression became more businesslike. "Mountain living requires constant preparation and maintenance. Food must be preserved for winter, firewood must be cut and stacked, clothing and equipment must be repaired regularly, and the cabin and outbuildings need ongoing care to remain weatherproof." He gestured toward the various areas of the cabin as he spoke. "Your mother's skills with cooking and household management will be essential for maintaining our comfort and health. You're old enough to help with food preservation, basic repairs, and caring for your younger siblings when your mother is occupied with other tasks." Daniel leaned forward with interest. "What about us? What can we do?" "Plenty," Zeke assured him. "Gathering firewood, feeding the animals, helping with the garden, learning to fish and hunt, maintaining the trails around the property. Mountain children grow up understanding that everyone in a household must contribute according to their abilities, because survival depends on the whole family working together effectively." Lucy had finished her stew and was now exploring the cabin with the fearless curiosity of a 4-year-old. She discovered a shelf of carved wooden animals and was examining each one with careful attention. "Did you make these?" she asked Zeke. "I did. During the long winter evenings when there's not much else to do except read, carve, or maintain equipment. Would you like to learn how to carve?" Lucy nodded enthusiastically, and Sarah felt the unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy. Her daughter was already forming a connection with this stranger that seemed effortless and natural, while Sarah herself remained uncertain about the wisdom of their current situation. As the evening progressed, Zeke showed them around the cabin's interior spaces. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, both furnished with sturdy beds and adequate storage for clothing and personal belongings. The children would share one room, while Sarah would have privacy in the other. Zeke's own sleeping area was a small alcove off the main room, partitioned with heavy curtains. The arrangement respects everyone's need for personal space, while acknowledging the practical realities of mountain living, Zeke explained as they concluded their tour. "During severe weather, we might all end up sleeping in the main room near the fire. But under normal circumstances, everyone has their own territory." Sarah appreciated his attention to propriety, but she was also beginning to understand that their new life would require adjustments to conventional social expectations. The cabin was comfortable and well-maintained, but it was also isolated in ways that would make their small group entirely dependent on each other for companionship, security, and survival. "How often do you go to town?" Sarah asked as they returned to the main room. "Every few weeks during good weather, less frequently in winter. Sometimes not at all between November and March, depending on snowfall and other factors. Mountain living requires self-sufficiency over extended periods." The implications of this isolation were beginning to sink in for Sarah. They would spend months at a time with no contact with the outside world, no access to medical care, no opportunity to change their minds if the arrangement proved unsuccessful. The decision she had made in desperation that afternoon was becoming more irrevocable with each passing hour. Zeke seemed to understand her growing apprehension. The isolation is challenging initially, especially for people accustomed to town life. But most folks find that it becomes one of the advantages rather than one of the hardships. No gossip, no social pressures, no expectations beyond those necessary for practical survival. You'll discover aspects of yourself and your children that never had opportunity to develop when you were constantly managing other people's opinions. Emma was examining the books on Zeke's shelves with obvious delight. "You have so many books. Are we allowed to read them?" "That's why they're here," Zeke replied. Education doesn't stop just because you're living in the wilderness. In fact, it becomes more important. Children who grow up understanding both civilization and wilderness have advantages that neither town children nor completely wild children possess. Sarah watched her daughter's face light up as she discovered volumes of poetry, history, and natural science that would have been impossible for them to afford during their recent poverty. Whatever else this arrangement might prove to be, it was already providing her children with opportunities they had lost when Thomas died. "What about winter?" Daniel asked. "What do we do when it's too cold to go outside?" Zeke's weathered face creased into a smile. "Winter is when mountain families become closest. We'll spend the evenings reading, telling stories, learning new skills, and planning for the next year's activities. I'll teach you to carve, to repair equipment, to understand weather patterns and animal behavior. Your mother might teach us songs or help us improve our reading and writing." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "Winter is also when you'll discover whether mountain living suits your family. By spring, you'll know if this arrangement is something you want to continue long-term, or if you prefer to return to civilization, with the experience of having tried something completely different." As the fire burned lower and the evening advanced, Sarah found herself observing the subtle interactions between Zeke and her children. He treated them as individuals rather than as generic children, remembering details from their brief conversations and responding to their different personalities with apparent ease. Emma's intellectual curiosity, the twins' physical energy, Lucy's artistic interests. He seemed to recognize and encourage each child's natural inclinations. More surprising was his interaction with Sarah herself. Despite the obvious power imbalance in their situation, he was providing everything, while she was contributing nothing. Initially, he treated her as an equal partner in decision-making about daily routines and household management. His questions about her preferences regarding meals, schedules, and domestic arrangements seemed genuinely interested in her opinions rather than merely polite. When the children began showing signs of exhaustion from their eventful day, Zeke helped Sarah settle them in their new bedroom. The beds were comfortable, with thick quilts and soft pillows that represented luxury after weeks of sleeping on thin mattresses in their tavern room. The children's excitement about their new accommodations was evident despite their tiredness. "Mama," Lucy whispered as Sarah tucked her into bed, "I like the mountain man. He makes good soup, and he has nice animals to look at." Sarah kissed her youngest daughter's forehead, marveling at the child's ability to adapt to dramatic changes with such equanimity. "Sleep well, sweetheart. Tomorrow, we'll explore our new home more thoroughly." Emma, ever the responsible eldest child, waited until her siblings were settled before speaking quietly to her mother. "Mama, are we going to stay here permanently?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know yet, Emma. We're going to try this arrangement and see how it works for everyone. Mr. Harrington seems like a good man, and we're certainly better off than we were this morning. But it's too early to make permanent decisions. I hope we can stay," Emma confessed. "I like having books to read again, and I think the boys will be happier here where they can run around and learn interesting things." "And you look less worried than you have in months." Sarah realized that her daughter was right. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't lying awake, calculating their dwindling resources and diminishing options. Tonight, her children would sleep with full bellies in warm beds, and tomorrow would bring opportunities to learn and grow rather than desperate schemes for basic survival. As she prepared for her own sleep in the comfortable bedroom Zeke had provided, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary turn their lives had taken. This morning, she had been a desperate widow begging on street corners. Tonight, she was a member of a mountain household with responsibilities, security, and prospects that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The mountain man had kept his word about providing food, shelter, and safety for her family. But Sarah was beginning to understand that what he was really offering was something much more valuable, the opportunity to discover who they could become when survival was no longer their primary concern. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of chopping wood outside the cabin. Through her bedroom window, she could see Zeke's silhouette against the pale morning light, his axe rising and falling with mechanical precision as he split logs for the fire. The rhythm was steady and hypnotic, speaking of years of practice and the kind of physical strength that came from constant hard work. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs, finding that Zeke had already started coffee and laid out ingredients for breakfast. The fire was crackling warmly, and the cabin felt more like home than anywhere she had lived since leaving the house on Maple Street. It struck her as remarkable how quickly her children had adapted to their new circumstances. She could hear them stirring upstairs, their voices carrying the excitement of children waking up in a place where adventures awaited. "You're an early riser," Zeke observed as he came through the door, carrying an armload of freshly split wood. "I haven't slept past sunrise in months," Sarah replied, moving toward the kitchen area. "Worry has a way of shortening sleep, and I suppose the habit has become permanent." Zeke arranged the wood in the box beside the fireplace with the same methodical care he seemed to bring to every task. "Worry's a luxury you can't afford anymore. Up here, energy spent on things you can't control is energy wasted when it could be used for things you can influence." Sarah began preparing breakfast, grateful for the abundance of supplies that allowed her to cook a proper meal without calculating the cost of every ingredient. "Is that another lesson from your military service?" "That's a lesson from staying alive in places where mistakes have permanent consequences," Zeke replied. "The war taught me to focus on immediate tactical situations. The mountains taught me to think strategically about long-term survival. Both skills are useful for raising children, though most parents never have occasion to discover that." Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs, already dressed and alert despite the early hour. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington. What can I help with?" "You can help your mother with breakfast while I check on the animals," Zeke said. "After we eat, I'll show you and your brothers around the property so you understand the boundaries and the daily routines." As Zeke headed toward the barn, Emma moved to assist Sarah with cooking. "Mama, do you think he's lonely up here by himself?" Sarah considered the question while she worked. "I think he's chosen solitude rather than had it forced upon him, which makes it different from loneliness. But yes, I suspect he's been alone long enough to appreciate having company. He knows an awful lot about children for someone who lives by himself." Emma observed with the perceptiveness that sometimes surprised Sarah with its maturity. "What do you mean?" Emma was quiet for a moment, arranging plates on the table. "He talks to us like he's used to explaining things to children. And last night when Lucy was getting fussy, he knew exactly how to distract her. Most men who don't have children of their own don't understand those things." Sarah realized that her daughter was right. Zeke's interaction with her children had been naturally paternal in ways that suggested experience rather than instinct. The observation raised questions about his background that their conversations hadn't yet addressed. The twins thundered down the stairs with the enthusiasm of 6-year-olds who had discovered that their new home offered unlimited opportunities for exploration. Lucy followed more sedately, clutching her cornhusk doll and examining the cabin's interior as if she was seeing it for the first time in daylight. Breakfast was a cheerful affair, with the children asking constant questions about their new environment and Zeke answering each inquiry with patient thoroughness. He explained the seasonal patterns that governed mountain life, the animals they were likely to encounter, and the skills they would need to develop to become useful members of the household. After the meal, Zeke led them outside for their first comprehensive tour of the property. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine and wood smoke that spoke of a world far removed from the dusty streets and commercial odors of Cedar Falls. Mountains surrounded their valley on all sides, creating a sense of protected isolation that was both peaceful and slightly overwhelming. The cabin sat in a natural clearing beside a stream that provided fresh water year-round. Zeke had expanded the cleared area to accommodate gardens, outbuildings and pasture for his animals, a milk cow, several goats, chickens and 2 horses, in addition to the mules they had met the previous day. Each structure showed evidence of careful planning and skilled construction. "How long did it take you to build all this?" Sarah asked as they examined the smokehouse, where meat was preserved for winter consumption. "The basic cabin took most of my first summer," Zeke replied. "The outbuildings and improvements have been ongoing projects ever since. Mountain living gives you plenty of time during the winter months to plan modifications and improvements for the following year." Daniel was fascinated by the workshop where Zeke maintained his tools and equipment. The space was organized with military precision, every implement clean and properly stored, ready for immediate use. "Do you make everything yourself?" "Everything I can," Zeke confirmed. "Self-sufficiency isn't just practical up here, it's essential. The nearest neighbor is 12 miles away, and town is a full day's journey under good conditions. If something breaks and you can't fix it yourself, you do without until you can make a supply run." David had discovered the chicken coop and was delighted by the dozen hens that wandered freely around the enclosed area. "Can we collect eggs?" "That'll be one of your daily chores," Zeke told him. "Chickens need to be fed and watered every day, and their eggs collected before they get broken or eaten by predators. Think you can handle that responsibility?" Both twins nodded eagerly, and Sarah found herself smiling at their enthusiasm for work that would have seemed like punishment in their previous life. The mountain environment was already changing her children's perspective on labor and responsibility. As they walked along the stream that bordered the property, Lucy tugged at Zeke's jacket. "Mr. Harrington, were you ever married?" The question seemed to catch Zeke off guard, and for a moment his composed demeanor flickered. Sarah saw something pass across his face, pain perhaps, or regret, before he crouched down to Lucy's level. "I was married once, a long time ago," he said quietly. "My wife and I had a little girl about your age." Lucy considered this information with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to important revelations. "Where are they now?" Sarah felt her breath catch, suddenly understanding that they were approaching the heart of whatever had driven Zeke to his mountain exile. Emma and the twins had stopped their exploration and were listening intently. Sensing that something significant was being discussed, Zeke was quiet for a long moment. His dark eyes focused on the rushing water. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke of old grief carefully contained, but never fully healed. "They died while I was away at war. There was an outbreak of fever in the town where they lived, and the medicine didn't arrive in time to help them. I came home to find graves that were already 2 months old." The silence that followed his words was profound. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes as she understood the full magnitude of what Zeke had experienced, losing his family while he was away fighting for causes that must have seemed meaningless in comparison to the people he couldn't protect. "I'm sorry," Emma said softly, her voice carrying the kind of genuine sympathy that children sometimes express more purely than adults. Zeke reached out and touched Emma's shoulder gently. "Thank you. It was a long time ago, but some losses stay with you no matter how many years pass. That's part of why I came to the mountains. There are some kinds of pain that can only be healed by solitude and time." Sarah understood now why Zeke had been watching their family with such careful attention, why he had recognized their desperate circumstances so clearly, and why he had been willing to take on the enormous responsibility of caring for 4 children and their mother. He wasn't just offering shelter to strangers, he was attempting to fill a void in his own life that had remained empty for 12 years. "Is that why you helped us?" Sarah asked gently. Zeke stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Partly. I've been alone long enough to appreciate what family means, and I've seen enough suffering to recognize when intervention might prevent unnecessary loss. Your children remind me that life continues even after devastating setbacks, and that sometimes the best way to honor what you've lost is to protect what you can save." Daniel, with the directness that 6-year-olds sometimes display, asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. "Do you want us to be your new family?" Zeke's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "I want you to be safe, well-fed, and happy. Whether that makes us a family is something we'll discover together over time. Family isn't something you can decide in a day. It's something that grows from shared experiences and mutual care." Sarah found herself deeply moved by his honesty. Zeke wasn't trying to replace what he had lost or what they had lost. He was offering them the opportunity to build something new from the raw materials of survival and mutual need. As they continued their tour of the property, Sarah noticed details that took on new meaning in light of what she now knew about Zeke's background. The cabin was built to accommodate a family, with bedrooms sized for children and common areas designed for shared activities. The gardens showed evidence of planning for multiple people rather than a solitary resident. Even the animals, gentle creatures suitable for children to handle, suggested that Zeke had been preparing for the possibility of having a family on the property long before he encountered the Mitchells in Cedar Falls. "How long have you been planning to invite someone to share your home?" Sarah asked as they examined the root cellar where vegetables and preserved foods were stored for winter. "I've been considering it for several years," Zeke admitted. "Mountain living is more sustainable and enjoyable when the work is shared among several people, and—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've reached the point where solitude has served its purpose. I've processed my losses and learned to live with them. Now I'm ready to focus on building rather than just surviving." Emma was examining the extensive library that Zeke had accumulated. Books on subjects ranging from practical skills to literature and philosophy. "You have more books than the school in Cedar Falls. Books are essential when you live this far from civilization," Zeke explained. "They provide education, entertainment, and companionship during the months when weather makes travel impossible. Some of these belong to my wife. She was a teacher before we married." The mention of his wife's profession explained much about the educational focus of Zeke's preparations. He had been married to someone who valued learning and intellectual development, and he had maintained that priority even in his wilderness exile. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what Zeke was offering her family. This wasn't simply shelter and sustenance. It was the opportunity to participate in a carefully planned and well-established homestead that could provide security, education, and personal growth for her children. More importantly, it offered them the chance to contribute meaningfully to something larger than their individual survival. "What happens if this arrangement doesn't work out?" Sarah asked as they concluded their tour near the cabin's front porch. Zeke considered the question seriously. "Then we'll address that situation when it arises. But I don't expect it to fail, Sarah. You're intelligent, capable, and motivated by the strongest possible incentive, your children's welfare. Your children are adaptable, curious, and well-behaved. Those are the ingredients for success in any challenging environment." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "The truth is, I need this arrangement to work as much as you do. I've been preparing for it for years, and I believe we can create something here that benefits everyone involved. Not charity, not temporary assistance, but genuine partnership in building a life that's better than what any of us could achieve individually." Sarah felt a shift in her understanding of their situation. This wasn't about a benevolent stranger rescuing a desperate family. This was about people who had experienced loss, finding ways to help each other heal while building something new and valuable together. The mountain man had revealed his truth, and it was far more complex and hopeful than Sarah had initially imagined. 3 weeks into their mountain life, Sarah woke to the sound of Emma crying. Not the quiet tears of a homesick child, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone experiencing profound emotional release. Sarah found her eldest daughter sitting by the bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and rose. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, settling beside Emma on the narrow bed. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to find words for feelings too complex for her 10 years. "I keep thinking about Papa and how he would have loved this place. And then I feel guilty for being happy here when he's not with us to see it." Sarah felt her own throat tighten with emotion. They had all been so focused on adapting to their new circumstances that there hadn't been time to properly process the grief that had been overshadowed by their fight for survival. Now, with immediate needs met and security established, the deeper emotional work of healing could finally begin. "Your father would want you to be happy," Sarah said gently. "He would want all of us to thrive, wherever that might be possible. Finding joy in this beautiful place doesn't diminish our love for him. It honors the values he taught us about making the best of whatever circumstances life presents." Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder. "Do you think we're going to stay here permanently? Or is this just temporary until we can afford to live somewhere else?" The question had been haunting Sarah's own thoughts with increasing urgency. Their arrangement with Zeke had been presented as flexible, something they could evaluate and modify as circumstances developed. But after 3 weeks of mountain life, the prospect of returning to town and resuming their previous struggle felt less like an option and more like a form of voluntary punishment. "I think that's a decision we'll need to make as a family," Sarah replied. "What do you think about staying here long term?" Emma was quiet for several minutes, considering the question with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to important decisions. "I think I'd like to stay. I love having books to read and interesting things to learn about. Daniel and David are happier than they've been since Papa died. They have work to do that makes them feel important. Lucy adores Mr. Harrington and treats him like the grandfather she never had." She paused, studying her mother's face in the growing daylight. "But what about you, Mama? Are you happy here?" Sarah realized she didn't have a ready answer to her daughter's question. Happiness seemed like a luxury she hadn't allowed herself to consider during their months of crisis. She had been focused on survival, on meeting immediate needs, on protecting her children from the worst consequences of their circumstances. The question of personal fulfillment had been set aside as irrelevant, but now, forced to examine her emotional state honestly, Sarah recognized that she was experiencing something that might indeed be happiness. She woke each morning without the crushing anxiety that had characterized her thoughts for months. She went to sleep each night without calculating and recalculating their dwindling resources. Most importantly, she could see her children developing and growing in ways that would have been impossible under their previous circumstances. "I think I might be happy," Sarah said slowly. "Or at least I'm discovering what it feels like not to be constantly afraid." Their conversation was interrupted by voices from downstairs, Zeke working with the twins on some project that involved considerable discussion and occasional laughter. Through the window, Sarah could see Lucy in the garden with the chickens, talking to them as if they were close friends who understood every word she said. "We should probably join the others," Emma said, wiping the last traces of tears from her face. "Mr. Harrington promised to teach us how to preserve apples today, and I don't want to miss learning something useful." As they dressed and prepared to start their day, Sarah reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed in such a short time. 3 weeks ago, she had been begging for coins on a street corner, humiliated and desperate. Today, Her children were excited about learning practical skills that would serve them throughout their lives, while she faced the day with confidence rather than dread. Downstairs, they found Zeke demonstrating the proper technique for peeling apples, while Daniel and David watched with intense concentration. A large basket of fruit sat on the table, along with the knives, spices, and equipment necessary for turning fresh apples into preserved food that would last through the winter months. "Good morning," Zeke said, looking up as Sarah and Emma appeared. "I thought today would be perfect for apple preservation. The weather's cool enough to make the work comfortable, and we've got enough fruit to justify the effort involved in setting up the process properly." Sarah had observed that Zeke approached every task as a teaching opportunity, breaking down complex procedures into manageable steps that even young children could understand and participate in. His patience with her children's questions and mistakes seemed unlimited, and his praise for their successes was genuine rather than condescending. "What can I do to help?" Sarah asked, moving toward the kitchen area where additional supplies were arranged. "You can supervise the actual preservation process, while I handle the more dangerous aspects like managing the fire and handling boiling water. The children can assist with preparation, peeling, cutting, measuring spices, and learning to recognize when the fruit has reached the proper consistency for long-term storage." What followed was several hours of collaborative work that felt more like a family activity than a chore. Emma proved naturally skilled at the precise cutting techniques required for even cooking. The twins, despite their young age, were capable of careful work when the task engaged their interest. Lucy contributed by sorting apples according to size and ripeness, a job that made her feel important while keeping her safely away from sharp knives and hot surfaces. As they worked, Zeke shared information about food preservation techniques, seasonal timing, and the planning required to ensure adequate supplies throughout the long mountain winters. Sarah found herself genuinely interested in the practical knowledge he was sharing, skills that would be useful regardless of where their family eventually settled. "How did you learn all this?" Emma asked as she watched Zeke demonstrate the proper consistency for preserved fruit. "Trial and error, mostly," Zeke replied. "My first few winters up here were challenging because I didn't understand how much food was required or how to preserve it properly. I lost a lot of supplies to spoilage and had to make emergency trips to town in dangerous weather because I hadn't planned adequately." David looked up from his apple peeling with curiosity. "Were you scared?" "Scared enough to learn from my mistakes," Zeke confirmed. "Fear can be a useful teacher if you pay attention to the lessons it's trying to provide. The key is learning to distinguish between rational fears that help you make good decisions and irrational fears that prevent you from taking necessary risks." Sarah realized that Zeke was teaching her children to think critically about decision-making and risk assessment in ways that would serve them well throughout their lives. These weren't lessons that most children learned in conventional educational settings, but they were perhaps more valuable than traditional academic subjects for developing practical wisdom and emotional resilience. Around midday, their work was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Sarah heard horses approaching the cabin and looked through the window to see two riders making their way down the trail from the mountain pass. Zeke's expression became alert and somewhat wary as he moved to observe the approaching strangers. "Do you recognize them?" Sarah asked, feeling a flutter of anxiety about contact with the outside world. "The horses look familiar, but I can't identify the riders from this distance," Zeke replied. "It's unusual to have visitors this late in the season. Most people avoid mountain travel once the weather becomes unpredictable." The riders proved to be Sheriff William Crawford from Cedar Falls, accompanied by a man Sarah didn't recognize, well-dressed and official-looking in a way that suggested government authority. As they approached the cabin, Sarah felt her stomach clench with apprehension about the possible reasons for their visit. Sheriff Crawford dismounted and approached the porch where Zeke waited to greet them. The lawman's expression was serious but not hostile, suggesting official business rather than immediate trouble. "Afternoon, Zeke," the sheriff said formally. "This is Marshal James Peterson from the territorial government. We need to speak with you and Mrs. Mitchell about some concerns that have been raised regarding her children's welfare." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she understood the implication of their visit. Someone had reported their family's situation to authorities who were now investigating whether her children were being properly cared for in their unconventional living arrangement. "What kind of concerns?" Zeke asked, his voice carefully neutral. Marshal Peterson stepped forward, consulting a notebook that he withdrew from his jacket pocket. "We've received reports that Mrs. Mitchell has abandoned her responsibilities as a mother by allowing her children to live in isolation with an unmarried man of questionable background. There are also questions about whether the children are receiving proper education and medical care." Sarah's hands were shaking as she realized that their new life was being threatened by people who viewed their arrangement as scandalous or inappropriate, rather than as the salvation it had proven to be. The happiness and security her children had found over the past 3 weeks could be destroyed by social conventions that valued appearances over actual welfare. "Who filed these reports?" Sarah asked, stepping forward to stand beside Zeke. "I'm not at liberty to reveal that information," Marshal Peterson replied. "But I am authorized to investigate the children's living conditions and make recommendations about their continued placement in this household." Emma appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices and the tension she could sense in the adult conversation. Behind her, the twins and Lucy clustered together, their faces showing confusion and fear about the strangers who seemed to be discussing their future. Sheriff Crawford's expression softened as he saw the children. He had known their family during their prosperous years in Cedar Falls and had witnessed their decline following Thomas Mitchell's death. His presence suggested that this investigation might be more sympathetic than Sarah had initially feared. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sheriff Crawford said gently, "I need to ask you some questions about your current living arrangement and your children's welfare. Would you prefer to speak privately, or would you like Mr. Harrington to be present during our conversation?" Sarah looked at Zeke, seeing in his steady gaze the same calm strength that had sustained her family through their most difficult challenges. Whatever questions these officials wanted to ask, whatever judgments they intended to make, she would face them with the support of the man who had already proven his commitment to her children's welfare. "I'd like Mr. Harrington to be present," Sarah said firmly. "He's been an essential part of my children's care and education since we arrived here, and he has the right to hear any accusations or concerns being raised about our household." Marshal Peterson opened his notebook and began asking detailed questions about their daily routines, educational activities, living arrangements, and future plans. Sarah answered each inquiry honestly, describing the dramatic improvement in her children's health, happiness, and development since joining Zeke's household. As the questioning continued, Sarah realized that she was no longer the desperate widow who had been willing to accept any form of assistance to keep her family alive. She had become someone with clear priorities, definite opinions, and the confidence to defend decisions that had proven beneficial for her children. The mountain life had changed, not just her circumstances, but her fundamental sense of who she was and what she was capable of achieving. "Marshal Peterson," Sarah said when he paused in his questioning, "I understand that our living arrangement may seem unconventional by town standards, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that my children are healthier, better educated, and more secure than they have been at any time since their father's death. Mr. Harrington has provided them with opportunities for growth and learning that I could never have afforded to give them independently." She gestured toward her children, who were listening to the conversation with obvious anxiety about its outcome. "Look at them. Do they appear neglected, mistreated, or unhappy? Do they seem like children who need to be rescued from their current circumstances?" Even Marshal Peterson despite his official skepticism, could not deny the evidence of the children's obvious health and contentment. They were clean, well-fed, appropriately dressed, and displaying none of the signs that typically accompanied genuine neglect or abuse. Sheriff Crawford closed his own notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, the law requires that I investigate reports of potential child endangerment, but it also requires that I recommend what's genuinely in the best interests of the children involved. Based on what I've observed here today, I see no evidence that your children are being harmed by their current living situation." He turned to address Marshal Peterson. "These children are clearly thriving under the care they're receiving. Unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing rather than social disapproval, I recommend that we allow this arrangement to continue without government interference." Marshal Peterson seemed reluctant to abandon his investigation, but the complete absence of supporting evidence for the complaints he had received made continued pursuit of the matter legally untenable. After making additional notes and issuing warnings about future monitoring, he and Sheriff Crawford prepared to depart. As the officials rode away from the cabin, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief mixed with determination. The external challenge to their new life had forced her to articulate clearly why she valued their mountain existence and was prepared to defend it against criticism or interference. "Are we going to stay?" Lucy asked in a small voice, still worried about the implications of the official visit. Sarah looked at each of her children, seeing in their faces the hope and anxiety that accompanied major life decisions. Then she looked at Zeke, whose steady presence had provided the foundation for their family's recovery and growth. "Yes," Sarah said with conviction that surprised her with its strength. "We're going to stay. This is our home now, and this is our family. We're going to make it work, because it's the best thing that's ever happened to us." The mountain man had offered them more than shelter and sustenance. He had offered them the opportunity to choose their own path forward, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to make that choice permanent. The first snowfall arrived earlier than expected, transforming their mountain valley into a pristine winter wonderland overnight. Sarah woke to an unfamiliar silence, the kind of profound quiet that comes when snow muffles all the usual sounds of forest life. Through her bedroom window, she could see that everything, trees, outbuildings, the stream banks, had been covered in a thick blanket of white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sunlight. Downstairs, she found Zeke already stoking the fire and preparing breakfast, his movements calm and methodical despite the dramatic change in weather conditions. The children were still sleeping, but Sarah could hear them stirring upstairs as the warmth from the fireplace began to spread through the cabin. "How much snow did we get?" Sarah asked, moving to the window to assess the accumulation. "About 8 inches, Zeke replied, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "Not unusual for this elevation in late October, but enough to remind us that winter is serious business up here. The next few months will test everyone's adaptability and patience." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm cup as she contemplated their first mountain winter. Over the past month, Zeke had been preparing them systematically for the challenges of cold weather living, but she was beginning to understand that intellectual preparation was different from the reality of being completely isolated for extended periods. "What should we expect?" she asked, settling at the kitchen table where she could watch the snow continuing to fall outside. "Weeks at a time when leaving the immediate area around the cabin is impossible or inadvisable," Zeke said, joining her at the table. "Temperatures that can kill unprepared people within hours. Complete dependence on the supplies we've stored and the systems we've established for heating, lighting, and food preparation." He paused, studying her face for signs of apprehension. "But also months of uninterrupted time for education, planning and developing the skills that will make us more self-sufficient when spring returns. Winter up here can be the most productive time of year if you approach it with the right mindset." The children appeared at the bottom of the stairs in various states of wakefulness, drawn by the smell of breakfast and the unusual quality of light filtering through the windows. Lucy was the first to notice the snow, pressing her face against the glass with the wonder that small children display when confronting natural phenomena that exceed their previous experience. "Can we go outside and play?" she asked, her breath fogging the window as she spoke. "After breakfast and after you're properly dressed for cold weather," Zeke replied. "Mountain snow is different from town snow, deeper, colder, and more dangerous if you don't respect it properly. But yes, we'll spend time outside so you can learn to move safely in winter conditions." Emma had been examining the view from various windows, her practical mind already working on the implications of their changed environment. "How long will the snow last?" "This particular snowfall will probably melt within a week or two," Zeke explained. "But from now until April, we should expect snow on the ground more often than not. By January, we'll have accumulations measured in feet rather than inches." David was bouncing with excitement at the prospect of serious snow. "Will we be able to build snow forts and have snowball fights?" "You'll be able to do all of that and more," Zeke assured him. "But you'll also learn to use snowshoes, to read weather signs that predict dangerous storms, and to understand how cold affects everything from water supplies to animal behavior. Winter survival skills become games when you learn them properly." After breakfast, Zeke outfitted each family member with appropriate cold weather clothing, heavy coats, waterproof boots, warm hats, and sturdy gloves that he had acquired over the years for exactly this purpose. Sarah was touched by his foresight in preparing for the needs of people who hadn't even known they would be sharing his life when he made these purchases. Their first venture into the snow-covered landscape was educational rather than recreational. Zeke showed them how to move efficiently through deep snow, how to recognize signs of dangerous ice conditions near the stream, and how to identify the winter shelters that various animals use during cold weather. Even Lucy, despite her young age, paid careful attention to instructions that could mean the difference between safety and serious trouble. The most important lesson about winter survival, Zeke explained as they examined animal tracks in the fresh snow, is that everything takes longer and requires more energy when conditions are difficult. Tasks that seem simple in summer, gathering firewood, feeding animals, even moving from the cabin to the barn, become complex operations that require planning and proper equipment. Emma was fascinated by the way their environment had been transformed overnight. "It's like living in a completely different place." "That's exactly what it is," Zeke confirmed. "Mountain people learn to adapt to multiple environments throughout the year. Summer skills, autumn skills, winter skills, and spring skills. Each season requires different knowledge and different approaches to the same basic tasks. They're outdoor." Exploration was interrupted by the sound of bells carried on the wind, a sound that seemed out of place in their isolated wilderness setting. Zeke's expression became alert as he listened carefully, then broke into a smile that Sarah hadn't seen before. "Those are sleigh bells," he announced. "Looks like we're about to have visitors who know how to travel properly in winter conditions." Within minutes, a horse-drawn sleigh appeared at the edge of their clearing, carrying 4 passengers bundled in heavy furs and woolen blankets. As the sleigh approached, Sarah recognized 2 of the occupants, Dr. Patterson from Cedar Falls and Pastor Williams from the church her family had attended during better times. The 3rd passenger was a woman Sarah didn't recognize, elderly and dignified, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their mountain homestead. The 4th was a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, whose bearing suggested education and professional status despite his practical winter clothing. "Zeke Harrington," Dr. Patterson called out as he climbed carefully from the sleigh. "I hope you don't mind unexpected visitors, but we have some business to discuss that couldn't wait for better traveling weather." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety about contact with people from their former life in Cedar Falls. The official investigation from the territorial marshal had been resolved satisfactorily, But she remained sensitive about how their unconventional living arrangement might be perceived by people who had known their family during more conventional times. Zeke greeted the visitors warmly, helping them unload supplies from the sleigh and inviting everyone into the cabin where coffee and the warmth of the fire could provide comfort after their cold journey. The children clustered near Sarah, uncertain about how they should behave around these formal visitors from the outside world. Pastor Williams was the first to address the obvious questions about their presence. "Mrs. Mitchell, I want to assure you that we're here as friends rather than investigators. The official inquiry into your family circumstances was resolved weeks ago, and Sheriff Crawford made it clear that your children are thriving under their current care." The elderly woman stepped forward with a directness that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother. "I'm Margaret Whitman, and I represent a group of families in Cedar Falls who have been discussing your situation with considerable interest. We understand that you've found stability and happiness in your current circumstances, and we wanted to explore whether there might be ways to formalize and support your arrangement." Sarah was confused by the woman's meaning. "Formalize how?" The younger man opened a leather portfolio he had been carrying. "I'm attorney Robert Chen, and I specialize in family law and property arrangements. Mrs. Whitman and several other concerned citizens have asked me to research the legal options available to families in unconventional living situations." Dr. Patterson moved closer to where the children were standing, his medical training evident in the way he observed their general health and demeanor. "May I say that you children look remarkably well? When I last saw your family, I was genuinely concerned about the effects of malnutrition and stress. The improvement in your condition is quite dramatic." Emma stepped forward with the confidence she had developed over their months of mountain living. "We're much healthier here than we were in town. Dr. Patterson, we eat regular meals, we get plenty of exercise, and we're learning skills that will help us throughout our lives." Attorney Chen consulted his notes before addressing Sarah directly. "Mrs. Mitchell, there are several legal mechanisms that could provide additional security for your family's current arrangement. Adoption procedures, guardianship agreements, property arrangements, and even incorporation as a family business entity. All of these could protect your interests while addressing any remaining social concerns about your living situation." Sarah looked at Zeke, seeing in his expression the same careful consideration that characterized his approach to all significant decisions. This visit represented an opportunity to legitimize their arrangement in ways that would provide additional protection against future interference. But it also involved commitments and legal complications that they hadn't previously considered. What would these arrangements accomplish? Sarah asked. Mrs. Whitman settled herself in one of the comfortable chairs near the fire. "They would provide legal recognition that your family unit is stable and legitimate, regardless of whether it conforms to conventional marriage arrangements. More importantly, they would establish Mr. Harrington's legal standing as a guardian and provider for your children, which would prevent future challenges to their living situation." Pastor Williams had been observing the cabin's interior with obvious appreciation for its organization and comfort. "I must say, this household shows every sign of proper Christian values and responsible family management. The children are well behaved, the home is well maintained, and everyone appears to be thriving under the current arrangements." Dr. Patterson was examining Emma's hands and posture with professional interest. "May I ask about your educational activities? I understand there are concerns in some quarters about whether children in isolated circumstances receive adequate intellectual development." Emma's face lit up with enthusiasm as she described their daily lessons, the extensive library available to them, and the practical skills they were learning alongside traditional academic subjects. Her obvious intellectual engagement and articulate communication skills provided clear evidence that her education was proceeding successfully. Attorney Chen made additional notes as Emma spoke. This level of educational engagement would satisfy any legal requirements regarding child welfare and development. In fact, it appears to exceed what most children receive in conventional school settings. The conversation continued for several hours, covering legal options, practical considerations, and the long-term implications of various formal arrangements. Sarah found herself increasingly interested in the possibility of establishing legal frameworks that would provide additional security for her family while preserving the independence and flexibility that had made their mountain life so successful. "There's one additional matter we wanted to discuss," Mrs. Whitman said as the formal business portion of their visit concluded. "Several families in Cedar Falls have children who might benefit from the kind of educational experience you're providing here. Would you be interested in establishing some form of seasonal educational program that could serve other families while providing additional income for your household?" The suggestion was unexpected and intriguing. Sarah realized that their mountain homestead could indeed serve as an educational resource for families seeking alternatives to conventional schooling, while the additional income could provide greater financial security for their own long-term planning. Zeke had been listening to the conversation without contributing significantly to the discussion, but now he spoke with the thoughtful consideration that characterized his approach to major decisions. "That's an interesting proposition," he said. "We've established systems here that could accommodate additional children during the warmer months. The educational opportunities are certainly superior to what most frontier communities can provide, and the practical skills training could benefit young people regardless of their eventual career paths." Emma was practically vibrating with excitement about the possibility of having other children visit their mountain home. "Could we really have students come here to learn? That would be wonderful." Dr. Patterson smiled at Emma's enthusiasm. "I think you'd make an excellent assistant teacher, young lady. Your own educational progress demonstrates that this environment produces remarkable results." As their visitors prepared to depart, Sarah realized that this unexpected meeting had opened up possibilities she had never considered. Their mountain refuge could become more than just a place of personal healing and growth. It could serve as a resource for other families seeking alternatives to conventional approaches to education and child development. "We'll need time to consider these proposals carefully," Sarah said as the group prepared to return to their sleigh. "But I'm genuinely interested in exploring how we might formalize our arrangements in ways that benefit everyone involved." Mrs. Whitman pressed Sarah's hand warmly as they said goodbye. "Take all the time you need, my dear. The important thing is that you've found stability and happiness for your family. Everything else is simply a matter of making that stability as secure as possible." After their visitors departed, Sarah and Zeke spent the evening discussing the various options that had been presented. The children, excited by the prospect of having other young people share their mountain experiences, offered enthusiastic support for whatever arrangements their parents might choose to pursue. "What do you think?" Sarah asked as they settled by the fire after the children had gone to bed. Zeke was quiet for several minutes, staring into the flames with the thoughtful expression that preceded his most carefully considered decisions. "I think we've built something here that's worth protecting and sharing. If formalizing our arrangements provides additional security for the children while creating opportunities to help other families, then we should seriously consider pursuing those options." He turned to look at Sarah directly. "But I also think we should remember that the most important thing we've accomplished is creating a family that works. Legal documents and business arrangements are useful tools, but they're not what makes a household successful." Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment as she considered how far they had all traveled since that desperate morning when she had stood on a street corner in Cedar Falls, begging for coins to feed her children. They had not only survived their crisis, they had emerged stronger, more capable, and more secure than they had ever been during their previous conventional life. The mountain man had offered them shelter from their immediate storm. But what they had built together was something far more valuable, a new kind of family based on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and the recognition that home could be created anywhere people were willing to work together toward common goals. Winter had arrived early, but Sarah Mitchell was no longer afraid of the cold. 5 years had passed since that desperate October morning when Sarah Mitchell stood on a street corner in Cedar Falls, clutching her starving children and begging for coins from strangers who looked away. Now, as she stood on the covered porch of their expanded mountain homestead, watching a dozen children from various families work together in the vegetable gardens under Emma's patient instruction, Sarah could barely recognize the broken woman she had once been. The Mountain View Educational Cooperative, as it had come to be known, had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. What began as a desperate family's refuge had evolved into a pioneering alternative education program that attracted families from across the Colorado Territory and beyond. The success of their unconventional approach to child development had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their isolated valley. "Mrs. Harrington," called out Timothy Morrison, a 12-year-old from Denver whose parents had enrolled him for the entire summer session. "Emma says we're ready to harvest the squash, but we need to check with you about the proper storage techniques." Sarah smiled at the title that had become natural over the years. She and Zeke had formalized their partnership through marriage 3 years earlier, not out of romantic necessity, but as a practical acknowledgement of the family they had built together and the legal protections it provided for their educational enterprise. The ceremony had been simple, conducted by Pastor Williams in their mountain meadow with their children and students as witnesses. "I'll be right there." "Timothy," Sarah replied, setting aside the correspondence she had been reviewing from families inquiring about enrollment for the following year. The stack of letters represented more applications than they could possibly accommodate, testament to the reputation their program had developed among parents seeking alternatives to conventional schooling. Emma, now 15 and serving as head assistant instructor, had grown into a confident young woman whose educational abilities impressed even the university professors who occasionally visited their mountain school. Her natural teaching skills, combined with her comprehensive knowledge of both academic subjects and practical mountain skills, made her invaluable in managing the diverse needs of their student population. The twins, Daniel and David, at 11 years old, had become expert guides for hiking expeditions and wilderness survival training. Their enthusiasm for outdoor activities, combined with their systematic approach to safety procedures, made them ideal instructors for city children experiencing mountain life for the first time. They had developed their own curriculum for teaching basic survival skills, which had been documented and shared with other outdoor education programs throughout the region. Lucy, now 9, had discovered a remarkable talent for working with animals and had taken responsibility for the expanded livestock operation that supported their growing community. Her gentle manner and intuitive understanding of animal behavior made her the natural choice for teaching younger students about animal care and the practical aspects of sustainable agriculture. Zeke had evolved from solitary mountain man to recognized educational innovator, though he remained most comfortable in his role as practical skills instructor rather than public spokesman for their program. His systematic approach to teaching complex tasks through manageable steps had been adopted by other educational institutions, and he corresponded regularly with educators who sought his advice about hands-on learning methodologies. The physical expansion of their homestead reflected the growth of their educational mission. Additional cabins provided comfortable accommodation for visiting students, while specialized buildings housed workshops, libraries, laboratories, and meeting spaces needed for comprehensive education. A network of trails connected various learning sites throughout their valley, creating an outdoor classroom that encompassed hundreds of acres of diverse terrain. But the most significant changes were less visible than the physical improvements. Sarah had discovered leadership abilities she never knew she possessed. Serving as director of the educational cooperative while managing correspondence with families, coordination with visiting instructors, and oversight of the complex logistics required to serve dozens of students throughout the year, her transformation from desperate widow to educational pioneer had not gone unnoticed by the broader community. She had been invited to speak at teachers' conferences, women's organizations, and government meetings about innovative approaches to child development. Her presentations consistently emphasized that their success had grown from necessity rather than theory, from practical solutions to immediate problems rather than abstract educational philosophy. The morning's work in the gardens provided an opportunity to observe the fruits of their educational approach in action. Children from privileged urban families worked alongside students from struggling frontier families, learning cooperation and mutual respect through shared labor. Academic instruction was seamlessly integrated with practical skills training, creating learners who were both intellectually capable and practically competent. Sarah, Zeke called from the workshop where he was demonstrating woodworking techniques to a group of older students. "We have visitors coming up the trail. Looks like an official delegation based on the quality of their horses and equipment." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of concern about unexpected official visits, though their legal status had been thoroughly established and their educational credentials were now recognized by territorial authorities. The Mountain View Educational Cooperative operated under proper licensing and met all requirements for alternative educational institutions. The delegation proved to be led by Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford himself, accompanied by the Territorial Superintendent of Education, a representative from the Federal Department of the Interior, and several other officials whose presence suggested business of considerable importance. "Mrs. Harrington," Governor Crawford said formally as he dismounted from his horse, "I hope you'll forgive our unannounced arrival, but we have a proposal that we believe will interest you and Mr. Harrington considerably." Sarah invited the officials into the main cabin where they could speak privately while the children continued their daily activities under Emma's supervision. The formal nature of their visit suggested opportunities or challenges that could significantly affect their future. "Operations, we've been following the development of your educational program with great interest," the superintendent of education began once everyone was settled. "Your success in combining academic instruction with practical skills training has attracted attention from educational reformers throughout the nation." The federal representative consulted an official-looking document as he spoke. "The Department of the Interior is developing new policies for education in frontier territories, and your program has been identified as a model that could be replicated in other regions facing similar challenges." Governor Crawford leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. "What we're proposing is territorial funding to expand your operation significantly, along with official designation as a demonstration site for alternative educational methodologies. The financial support would allow you to serve many more families while developing teacher training programs that could spread your methods to other locations." Sarah felt her pulse quickening as she understood the magnitude of what was being offered. Official recognition and financial support could transform their small mountain school into an institution with regional or even national influence. But it would also mean accepting government oversight and adapting their organic family-based approach to meet bureaucratic requirements. "What would be expected of us in return for this support?" Zeke asked, his practical mind immediately focusing on the obligations that would accompany such benefits. "Detailed documentation of your methods, regular reports on student progress, accommodation of official visitors and inspections, and participation in teacher training programs," the superintendent replied. Also, cooperation with research studies that could help other institutions adopt similar approaches. The federal representative added additional requirements. Federal funding would require compliance with standardized testing protocols, formal credentialing for instructors, and integration with established educational systems to ensure students could transition smoothly to conventional schools or universities. Sarah realized that accepting this offer would fundamentally alter the character of their educational community. The informal, family-oriented approach that had made their program so effective would be replaced by bureaucratic structures designed to serve governmental rather than educational priorities. We'll need time to consider this proposal carefully, Sarah said diplomatically. Our success has been built on flexibility and responsiveness to individual student needs. We want to ensure that any changes we make continue to serve the children effectively, rather than just satisfying administrative requirements. After the officials departed, Sarah and Zeke spent hours discussing the implications of the government offer. The financial benefits were substantial, and the opportunity to influence educational policy on a broader scale was appealing. But both of them had serious concerns about whether their essential mission could survive the institutionalization that federal support would require. "What do you think Emma would say?" Sarah asked as they walked through the evening quiet of their valley. Observing the students engaged in various independent activities, she'd probably point out that we didn't create this place to impress government officials, Zeke replied. We created it to provide the kind of education and family life that serves real children with real needs. If expanding means compromising those core values, then expansion might not be worth the benefits. Their conversation was interrupted by Lucy, who came running from the animal enclosures with news that one of their goats was showing signs of difficult labor. What followed was a demonstration of everything their educational approach had accomplished. Students from various backgrounds working together to assist with a complex problem, applying both academic knowledge and practical skills while learning valuable lessons about responsibility and cooperation. Emma took charge of organizing the human resources needed for the emergency, directing older students to specific tasks while ensuring younger children could observe and learn without interfering. Daniel and David gathered supplies and equipment with the efficiency that came from years of mountain living. Lucy provided expert guidance about animal behavior, while Sarah and Zeke supervised the overall process. By the time the crisis was resolved successfully, with a healthy kid delivered, and mother and baby thriving, Sarah realized that she was witnessing the true measure of their educational success. These children hadn't just learned academic subjects or practical skills. They had developed the kind of character and competence that would serve them throughout their lives, regardless of what challenges they might face. "You know," Emma said, as they cleaned up after the successful animal delivery, "I think I understand why you and Zeke are hesitant about the government offer. What makes our school special isn't the buildings or the formal curriculum. It's the fact that we're a real family dealing with real situations, and everyone gets to participate in solving problems that actually matter." David, wise beyond his 11 years, added his own observation. "If we became like other schools, with tests and rules about everything, we'd stop being the kind of place where children can discover what they're really capable of doing." As autumn returned to their mountain valley, the season when their story had begun 5 years earlier, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. She had started as a desperate woman with no options, and had become someone whose opinions were sought by government officials and educational experts. But more importantly, she had discovered that family could be created from the most unlikely circumstances, that home could be built anywhere people were willing to work together toward common goals, and that the best education came from real experiences shared with people who cared about each other's welfare. The mountain man who had spoken those life-changing words, "They're all mine now," had kept his promise in ways that neither of them could have imagined on that desperate October day. He had taken responsibility not just for their immediate survival, but for their long-term growth and development as human beings. Standing on her porch as the sun set behind the peaks that surrounded their valley, Sarah Mitchell Harrington looked out at a landscape that had become synonymous with hope, opportunity, and the power of human resilience to transform disaster into triumph. The starving mother who had begged for coins on a street corner had become an educational pioneer whose work was influencing policy discussions in the nation's capital. But the real measure of their success wasn't found in official recognition or government offers. It was found in the laughter of children who were discovering their own capabilities, in the confidence of young people who knew they could handle whatever challenges life might present, and in the knowledge that sometimes the most desperate circumstances could lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. The mountain man had offered them shelter from their immediate storm. Together, they had built something far more valuable, a new way of understanding what family could be, what education could accomplish, and what human beings could achieve when they refused to let circumstances define their destiny. As the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Sarah Mitchell Harrington smiled at the thought that somewhere, perhaps, another desperate family was about to discover that their lowest moment might actually be the beginning of their greatest adventure. The cycle of hope, hard work, and healing would continue, carried forward by people who understood that the most important lessons in life couldn't be found in any textbook, but had to be lived, shared, and passed on through the simple act of caring for each other through whatever storms life might bring. The mountain man had said, "They're all mine now," to a starving family with nowhere left to turn. In the end, he had been absolutely right, but they had become his in ways that had enriched all their lives beyond measure, and the legacy of that moment would continue long after the last student had graduated, carrying forward the knowledge that home, family, and hope could be created anywhere people were brave enough to choose love over fear, cooperation over competition, and possibility over despair. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.